We made the shift in this section of the course from Plato to Aristotle. Aristotle was of course a student of Plato's, but Aristotle in many ways separated himself from Plato, just as Plato had from Socrates. Yet all three, that is to say Socrates himself, Plato, and Aristotle, are considered roughly, broadly speaking, Socratics. Now, they're considered Socratics not for method, because Aristotle initially, early in his life, did write dialogues. And then once he began to develop his own perspective, he set them on fire, he tossed them out. So we don't know very much, if at all, about the content of those. So, and Aristotle makes a move, certainly away from Plato. He makes a move that is much more, as we'll see, towards adopting a much more realistic or empirical perspective. He has certainly an ideal polis, and at the end of the discussion of Aristotle, you'll see what that ideal polis looks like. But it develops a different kind of mentality, and it's been explained in part because he came from a medical family. He, at least early in his life, seems to have been trained in medicine. He had an interest in nature and how the world actually worked. That's going to be a key theme. So why do we call Aristotle Socratic? Well, the main reason, period, is that Aristotle, like Plato, like Socrates, were all concerned with achieving full fulfillment, right? Eudaimonia. That all of them were committed to this idea in varying ways, of course. They were committed to the idea that the highest calling of human beings, the thing that makes us fully human, is in particular is contemplation. It's engaging in philosophy. So happiness and philosophical contemplation all go together, and that commitment to priority of philosophy and the priority of reflection, right? Of thinking about the great truths, certainly defines all three authors. Now, there are other ancient philosophers who have similar kinds of views, but they're not following quite in that same Socratic tradition. The Stoics, for example, the early Stoics, certainly were influenced by the Socratic Platonic view, but nevertheless, their position was in many ways distanced from that view. So it wasn't. You can't really call them Socratics in the same way. All right. So in any case, Aristotle develops a point of view that is consciously a rejection of Plato's. Book 2 of the Politics is largely a trashing of Plato's Republic. I can't go into the details of how that works, but it's clear that Aristotle has significant criticisms, significant problems of varying sorts. He doesn't just say, "Oh, this won't work. This is utopian." What he actually takes it apart, takes the arguments apart, and demonstrates that they're fallacious, for example. Now, where Aristotle in particular differs is in terms of the idea of the moral and political realm. You'll notice that the first part of your readings are from a work by Aristotle called the Nicomachean Ethics. It's called the Nicomachean Ethics, because it was edited by Aristotle's own son, Nicomachus. There's another ethics, the Eudemian ethics, that has similarities, but the Nicomachean ethics is certainly considered to be, and it is, it simply has a stronger argument. It's more detailed. So, Nicomachean ethics. Why are we starting with ethics? This is a political theory class, right? Not an ethics class. So why start with ethics? Well, the sort of historical reason is that it's very clear that the ethics and politics were at one time a single work. They were at one time a single work. They were a single work that's in the course of editing, in the course of time, were wound up being separated. And the intellectual reason we know this is how Aristotle starts the Nicomachean ethics. He starts it by talking about political science. He is the person who coins the term political science. It's episteme politicae. Give you the transliterated Greek. And it gets translated generally, as I've said, and I think in your translation it does, as political science. It is, as the tradition develops and you get into, especially the Roman tradition, it's talked about as civil science, same thing, scientia civilis, and it becomes essentially once Aristotle comes back, we'll talk about that process. Political science and civil science simply are brought together; they're allied. And he says that political science is the master science of the good. Political science is the master science of the good. Political science, in other words, teaches us how to achieve the good. Now, by the good, we're not talking about this ultimate contemplation I was talking about, right? But we're talking about the realm of human activity, of human action, of seeking the good in the sense of virtue, in the sense of an active way of living. And this relates to Aristotle's understanding of knowledge. He has a very clear understanding, systematic understanding of the forms of knowledge. The first one is poesis. And poesis is the kind of knowledge that people need in order to engage in technical activities, right? In order to build houses, you have to have architects who know what they're doing. In order to design, I don't know, aqueducts or public utilities, you've got to have somebody who knows how those things work. And so the knowledge they have, he says, is poesis. And you're going to look at it and say, "Oh, it's poetry." No, it's not. It has an entirely different meaning. The second form of knowledge, right, is practical. Practical knowledge is concerned directly with how we live as social beings, as moral beings. It is, in other words, a guide to how to live a good life. And a good life here of course, equating to, at least at this level, equating to a eudaimonic life. Certainly, Aristotle believes that human beings, as individuals, are capable of achieving eudaimonia. See why in a few minutes. And more importantly, he thinks that the polis is the highest realm, is the greatest realm for achieving eudaimonia. And that is going to be an important element in his theory. Now, he makes a distinction in the practical realm between the individual the family, and the polis. And he says that the polis has to rely on the functions of the family, and indeed, the polis, or at least the virtuous polis, has to rely upon people who have been trained in virtue, people who are themselves good people. Now he's going to talk about in chapter 3, and that's the next set of lectures. He's going to talk about the relationship between the good man and the good citizen. And he thinks something like this: you cannot be a truly good citizen if you're not a virtuous person. So that's a precondition. But he says that, in effect, you need one more quality in order to be a virtuous citizen, a good citizen, and that quality is prudence. In other words, you know how to apply the virtues in the context of a political environment, in the context of making decisions about the polis. So, but it's in the polis that we can achieve eudaimonia. Ultimate eudaimonia at the level of the practical. The individual is a matter of sort of the ethical realm, and that's why the important reason why we're starting with the ethics. In the ethical realm, can achieve happiness, but only in a very kind of limited way. The final attainment of happiness, keep using happiness, the final attainment of eudaimonia, of fulfillment, again, at the level of human action, is in the polis. The family, the household, and so he's not, just to be clear about this, the Greek word is oikos, right? So, which is the etymological origin of economics. But what Aristotle has in mind is not the nuclear family, not the way we tend to think about a family. It's essentially an extended family that may have that may have not only children in it, but other relatives, aunts, uncles, parents, etc., etc. It also has slaves, and of course, Aristotle famously in the first book of the Politics talks about precisely the slaves, and it is going to have some kind of economic in the sense of acquisition, right? The household exists in order to guarantee the material conditions for the life of the polis, and especially the life of citizens. And the only person in this context who can be a citizen is essentially the head of the household. And all of that is necessary, So the family is the material realm. And his view is that citizenship, the political realm, depends upon both good moral education and having the material conditions in order to essentially, in order to have leisure. And that leisure is a theme he keeps coming back to. In order that you have the time to engage in the life of citizenship. And an important, I think, difference here, I mean, it's actually a crucial difference between Aristotle and Plato's Socrates / Plato, is this emphasis on praxis, right? The political, or the practical rather. That we become fulfilled, completed human beings, not through contemplation, not through mental exercise, but through doing the good, through ensuring that that we have enough in order to support leisure, and so managing the household, and then ultimately the realm of political action, the action of citizens in making policies, and in particular in identifying the common good or the common interest. Being able to deliberate, being able to share office. These are preconditions, as I've said, but they're all active. They're all active. They are not intellective. And here Aristotle separates considerably from the tradition that he is part of. And that is probably the most important element, the most significant element of his of what makes him unique, at least vis-a-vis the broadly speaking, the political thought, is that emphasis on action. Virtue is active both at the individual level and especially at the political level. Now he does, and here again he does go back to elements, right, of the Socratic contemplation. And the word in Greek is, again, a word that we would think of differently. It's theoria. Philosophical contemplation is still for him the highest good. It produces the greatest happiness, the greatest fulfillment. It is significantly, it completes us significantly more than simply the practical realm. Now, his view is pretty clearly that on the one hand, you need to have this practical virtue. It's a precondition of this ability to contemplate, to engage in philosophy. But it's not. The two are not conflated, right? And that's his problem with the Socratic Platonic tradition. It conflates philosophy with the practical realm, right? With politics. And he denies, in effect, that in the sense that Plato talked about it in the Republic and elsewhere, that there can be a philosophical politics. It just doesn't make any sense for him. So he's dividing up different forms of knowledge, but in a way that is both logically structured, or that is coherent and that separates out different kinds or different ways of experiencing the world. So contemplation is the most important, but it cannot be a la Plato, a la the Republic. It cannot be a stand-in, ultimately, for the world of action, of ethics, and of politics. Philosophy can't replace that, or can't guide it. At least not the kind of intellective philosophy that Aristotle thinks, quite rightly. Aristotle, and I'm doing that, Socrates and Plato advocated that's just a category error. It's just a mistake. So that's why we have to start with the ethics. Now, I want to make one more comment that I think is really important before we sort of start getting into the details, about this idea of a political science. And science is, because of the implications of science, the word science, in our own day, it's important that he's not talking about science the way, say, my colleagues in the political science department would talk about science. It's somewhat different. It's not entirely different. It's not entirely alienated, but there are significant differences. All right, so for Aristotle, the study of the political realm, the study of politics, has two features, necessary features, that go together. One of which is a descriptive or explanatory feature. Descriptive or explanatory feature. The question is essentially, how do things work? And in this sense, and this is going to come out especially in books 5 and 6, which we'll get to down the track. But what he wants to know is, how do different political systems, different constitutions, function? How do they fail? But he's looking for empirical explanations. Right? He's looking for things that are observable, that are demonstrable. And this is an important element of his so-called naturalism. Right? He's interested in how things work. Now, remember, this is a guy who, amongst his various writings, wrote a number of works on, for example, on animals, again, based on empirical work, or his empiricism. He was interested, he wrote a work on the heavens, De Caelo, as well as works of important works of logic. And he wants to hold the whole thing together. He thinks knowledge can be through a combination of description and a kind of a philosophical analysis, not a Platonic philosophical analysis, but a conceptual analysis. And he also has then in his political science the normative. The normative, i.e., making evaluations about good and bad, just and unjust, when it comes to political systems. In other words, the question, how ought things to be? How ought things to be? That's a terrible question mark. And he thinks that these two things go together, that you can't separate the normative from the descriptive. Right? The normative, making evaluations that also pertain to and to some extent are engaged with how politics is actually practiced. Now, of course, what's happened in the history of the study of politics is these two things have become detached. And I can't go into either the reasons for it, but what we have is what's today called the fact-value distinction. Facts are facts, they're observable. They tell us, they give us information in order to construct explanations and laws and so forth. Values, by contrast, can't be evaluated in the same way. Values are concerned directly with, because they're concerned with questions of what ought to be. The argument that's made is that they are ultimately subjective, they're ultimately opinions, that you can't prove that one set of values or evaluations is better or superior to another. And so it has no use, it has no, it makes no contribution to an objective understanding of how the world works. But Aristotle doesn't buy that, right? Aristotelian science, by contrast, Aristotelian study of politics is, by contrast, says, well, the reason we ought to study how things work is in order to understand how we can improve them, and improve them in very specific kinds of ways, not materially, but morally. But on the other hand, and again, the Platonic mistake is to say, we don't care about how things work. We don't, just throw it all out the window. And we're going to simply engage in this kind of how things ought to be without any consideration for how things are. So for Aristotle, these two elements absolutely go together, and they're inescapably related. And that is the core of Aristotelian political science, is that commitment to, that belief that ultimately you cannot have a good science that doesn't take both elements into consideration for just the reasons I've talked about. The normative requires the empirical requires the normative. You just can't distinguish them. So, and this is, I think, a very important thing to realize in terms of when he's talking about political science and all that entails, that he's talking about this way of thinking about the world. And this is going to come out very clearly when we start, when we dive into some of the later books of the politics. It's going to come out clearly because we'll see how Aristotle is engaged in this simultaneously in this activity. So, just talk about this briefly, the structure of the politics in this regard, and the ethics in the politics. The ethics is an extended discussion of how individuals can acquire virtue, and thus as individuals become fulfilled, right? Achieve eudaimonia, but as individuals. The first book of the politics is largely concerned with economics, with household management, with acquisition. Aristotle never wrote a separate work on economics, on household management. Economics, in the sense, means household management. It means the management of the family. So we there were imitations of it done in later times, but book one of the politics is probably the closest to his idea of economics. And then when we get to books 3 through 8, and 8 was left unfinished. When we get to those chapters, we look at basically the basic elements of different regimes. And so we get a classification of forms of constitutions, which is systematic, but also in that classification of forms of constitution, we have on the one hand, broad categories, and on the other hand, a recognition that within those broad categories, there may be very different or kinds of ways of actualizing them. So that in democracy, for instance, there's one form of democracy, but there are multiple kinds of arranging political power that are all fundamentally consonant with the principles of democracy. And then when we get to 5 and 6, he's going to even become more empirical. He's going to become more empirical because he is interested, or comes to be interested, in issues about political change. And again, with both of these elements at work. And then after that, you get his conception of the ideal polis, the ideal system of government, where he finally, essentially, on the one hand, comes out and says, this is the best system. This is the most just system. This is the way in which the ends of the polis are achieved, on the one hand. But even there, he talks very clearly about the mechanisms that would be necessary to create such a polis, if it could be created. Very explicit. Questions of geography, questions of class structure, questions of education, on and on and on. So even there, he's thinking in a much more practical sense about what it would require for such a polis to exist. Now, it's not clear to me whether, any more than Plato's Republic, that he actually had in mind that such a polis could be created. But he's telling us, again, unlike Plato, if such a polis is possible, here is what you need to do. Here are the conditions that are required in order for that polis to exist. So, I mean, I'm sort of giving us an overview here. I think because it's really important to understand that the whole of the politics, in fact, is a realization. This is why political science and master science are the good, right? But it is through this dual and yet closely related set of elements that it is possible to come to some way of thinking about, what is most just in terms of constitutions and political systems. But it builds towards that, and he never loses that. He never loses that insight. Well, okay, that's sort of a big picture of what's going on in the politics, and to some extent how it's related to ethics. But I want to talk a little bit more about his ethical theory. Just a few elements of it, because again, this underlines where Aristotle is departing from the preceding tradition. First of all, Aristotle is very clear that human beings are not by nature good or bad. In other words, morality isn't located, or virtue isn't located in nature per se. He says that the best we have when we're talking about nature is a possibility to become good or bad, right? That it is the Greek word is dynamis. It is a sort of a disposition on the part of human beings to become moral beings in one way or another, to achieve morality. And he is clear that every person, I mean, no one cannot achieve some sort of moral standing, whether it's vice or virtue. But as we're born, our nature, it's only a potentiality. Dynamis probably is better translated as potentiality there. That has to be brought out, and it has to be brought out through education, an education of a very particular kind. And that is education that is based on hexis. Hexis it's often translated as habit, right? But I think it's better a disposition toward action. In other words, hexis is the development of moral qualities, again, whether virtuous or vicious. And the way in which that is achieved is through action, not through contemplation, but through action. Specifically, the engagement in repetitively in those acts that constitute the various virtues. So we become courageous by acting courageously, and we become temperate by acting in temperate matters. So the cardinal virtues are still there, but they're understood in a completely different way. They're conceptualized in a completely different way. In this way of talking about practical realm. And that's why he says it's so important that from the beginning, a child receive a rigorous education, be assiduously trained in behavior. Because if you don't, then there's no guarantee at all. In fact, there's a guarantee that you won't be virtuous, that you won't achieve what you can achieve as an individual in terms of fulfillment. And in turn, then, what you can achieve as a member of a citizen of the polis. So it's external action that is first and foremost. And what external action does is to form character. The character of a person, the ethos of a person, is in fact the combination of qualities, moral qualities, that they have acquired. So good character, bad character. And importantly, characters don't change. Right? Once they're inculcated, once you achieve a level of moral maturity, they're fixed. And they are Aristotle says, these qualities that lead to character, right? These qualities that lead to the development of character are permanently ingrained. So again, very important to train children young. Very important that their environment and their influence reinforce acting virtuously, learning how to be virtuous, because those then are essentially what am I looking for? Ingrained in the soul. in a way that can't be changed. In other words, there's that point at which you achieve moral maturity. And in achieving moral maturity, you're fixed. Now, for the virtuous person, achieving moral maturity makes you or is signified by not only a disposition to do good, but a recognition through reason of what the good is. So it's not the reason goes away, but it's secondary. Likewise for the vicious person, the person who lacks all of the virtues. It's the case that that person will not rationally recognize, but will instead give way constantly to his appetites, his desires, his pleasures. And just as with the preceding tradition, it's understood that that appetite is essentially is essentially contradictory to eudaimonia, to complete human human fulfillment, realization. So again, develop character, it's fixed. Qualities that you have, your dispositions to act in a certain way, to, when called upon to be courageous, act courageously. For example, that is for Aristotle the fundamental principle of this moral psychology, the fundamental principle that is going to undergird not only his conception of the moral standing of the individual, but then, as we'll see, as I alluded to, the requirements for the conditions for a good citizen. The one other thing I want to mention is that Aristotle, of course, is well known for the idea of the golden mean. And for him, virtue is a middle point between deficiency and excess. Between deficiency and excess. In other words, between having too little of the qualities necessary or having too much of them. And moderation and the mean are themes that we're also going to see when we get to the politics. And he alludes to them more or less explicitly. So, courage is a useful example, right? Courage is a virtue. Well, a deficiency of courage, of course, is cowardice. And an excess of it, right, is rashness. Cowardice, I think we had a pretty good idea of, right? It is when you, when confronted with a circumstance in which you're called upon to be courageous, you run away. You don't act in that courageous manner. But rashness is interesting because what he's saying is that courage also requires some kind of judgment about when it is necessary that you don't act, or you don't act in an obviously courageous way. The rash person is the person who, instead of being measured, right, instead of understanding the mean, will just rush into battle, for example, even if there's no chance of winning. The courageous person understands when it is best to act courageously, but also when it is best to refrain from sort of this, just overweening action. So this is a theme, this idea of moderation of the mean, which is a central idea in the ethics, is a theme that runs throughout Aristotle's writing, at least his political writing. All right, well, with that in mind, I'm going to stop this first part of the lecture, and then we are going to pick up with the book one of the Politics and the succeeding books, and see how that argument works.